That's better than I got last time, I'll say for sure. Today it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. His name is Dr. Bob Blackbird, better known as Dr. Bob. They very seldom say your last name, right? For the last 14 years, he's been director of the History Center, the State History Society, okay, Historical Society for Oklahoma. He's done a great job. He's a native Oklahoman. Grew up and went to school in Edmond, I believe. He graduated from Putnam City High School, and he went to Southwestern for a basic degree. And they even recognized you at a later point in life, I think, as a distinguished alumni, which was something to be proud of. He went on to continue his education at Oklahoma State University. He asked me to say for sure he had nothing to do with some of the things going on over there. He did not know any of those people. He did not play football. He did not talk to the football players. Did not bribe the football players or anything else. So I want to clear that up so you'll be received properly. He has authored 18 books. He's written numerous articles, different things like this over the years. Produced plays, I think, different things like this, historical plays. And he was interested, I'm sure many of you have seen, and if you haven't, you should see the Oklahoma History Building across the street from the Capitol, a beautiful thing, one of the best in the nation, and we're so pleased to have it. He helped engineer that thing and put it together and make it work. And please join me at this time to welcome Dr. Blackbird.
I'm going to take my jacket off. When I was at OSU, we had a recruit named Dexter Manley. Some of you may remember Dexter. Well, you have a speaker coming to town in a couple weeks, Bill Corbett. We were all teaching assistants at OSU, and Dexter was in his class. And he finally realized Dexter could not read. Totally illiterate. And Bill flunked him. Well, he later ended up in another professor's class and somehow miraculously learned how to read quickly because he passed the class. But that's gone on forever at all schools. But and I was not involved with sex for recruits. I can't say that. When Richard asked me to come today, I said, well, my normal speeches for Kiwanis clubs and Lions clubs and Rotaries is more of an entertaining speech where I tell a few stories. But he asked me to do a little bit more than that today, so it's a bit of a challenge, especially in 20 minutes. But I want to organize my comments about the state of Oklahoma, Cherokee Outlet, Alva, in the context of connecting the dots. And as each of you know as community leaders, and usually if you're a member of a Kiwanis Club, you're a community leader, you know that connecting the dots between economic development, education, farm and ranch, long-term development, and quality of life all has to be together. You cannot do one without the other. If you ignore part of your community, the rest will eventually suffer. You may do okay for a while, but it will not survive. Well, I'm in town today in a couple of other meetings talking to the folks trying to preserve the POW camp, trying to do something about historic preservation downtown, developing the Cherokee Strip Museum. Is that the name of the museum? Cherokee Strip Museum. Making sure that we collect the story of people from Woods County and Alva in particular. So how do we put all this together? Well, the best way to do it is connect the dots. And as I often say, there are three keys in historic preservation. That is to have high standards, to really set your goals high, and to say we're not going to barely get by, we're going to have a great institution or a great program. So you have to have the high standards. You have to be efficient, not just in building it, but in sustaining it. And then third, you have to have partners. I've used that in my career at the Historical Society for 34 years. I've known Donovan almost, well, longer than that. I met Donovan in '76, so it's good to see you here, Dr. Blackbird. But without partners, we cannot do it by ourselves, especially in the nonprofit community. But it's even that way in the for-profit community. You may do well for a while as a car dealer or a publisher, but you're not going to make it if your schools are not strong, if your economy is not strong, that the next generation has hope that their future will be better tomorrow than it is today. So what I'd like to do, and you can test me, I'm going to in fact keep my watch handy here. Before I make my concluding remarks, I am going to connect the dots in the big picture that has influenced the history of Woods County and Alva. And I am going to start 70 million years ago. So if I can do 70 million years of history in 10 minutes, I get the gold star today. The reason I'm starting at 70 million years ago is visible as I came into town today. Looking at all of those trucks on the road, looking at the pump jacks actually moving these days, of drilling rigs, of people stringing the water pipes to get water to a drill site. That is there because of what happened starting 700 million years ago when there was a vast inland sea that covered all of Oklahoma. The Rocky Mountains were not there 700 million years ago. It was a great inland sea that was there for for over 600 million years. And in that time, the sea would recede, it would expand, go back and forth, and each time the environment would change, it would lay another layer of sediment on the bottom of that inland sea. And that inland sea started building up with what we now call limestone and sand and clays. Each zone specific to a time period. If you're a geologist in the oil company, you know about those zones. Well, that was laid down over all these years, and each time another zone would be laid down, there would be organic materials. 70 million years ago, with the uplift from the Rocky Mountains, suddenly the land was being tilted. The inland sea receded, and it was dry land. Well, jumping 70 million years to, we think, somewhere between 10 and 30,000 years ago, humans made their way into what is now Oklahoma. They were hunters, gatherers. They moved across the land, did not leave many traces of their settlement. But society was developing. A worldview was developing. The spirituality of American Indians, their relationship to the land, and to other Indian groups. So all this would continue evolving in a revolving wheel until the 1720s, when traders out of New Orleans from France were coming up the rivers and trading with the Indians on the high plains. The Comanches had all of this wealth in terms of horses and furs, salt, slaves. The French had a market for a lot of these goods. The Wichita became the middleman. And they set up a village not far from here on Deer Pond Creek. And in the 1720s, it was a palisaded community. For many years, archaeologists thought it was the first non-Indian city in Oklahoma. It turns out it was not a non-Indian city. It was a Wichita village with a lot of French trade goods, because they were trading these French goods with the Comanche and other plains tribes. We have done an archaeological dig there. We have the evidence. We have the story of that site in the 1720s. Fast forward to 1803, Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon needs to raise money in his fight with England and the rest of the Western world at the time, and he sells to the United States the Louisiana Territory, including all of Oklahoma, except the Oklahoma Panhandle, and theoretically Greer County, but the rest of it was all included in Louisiana Purchase. Suddenly we're a part of the United States. Thomas Jefferson looks at this land as a resource. He sends Lewis and Clark. He sends Pike. He sends Lieutenant Wilkinson, who comes through this part of the world down the Arkansas River, trying to decide, what are we going to do with these new resources? In a nutshell, they decided this would be the Indian Territory. This was a place to take tribes from the American Southeast in the Mid-Atlantic and move them out of the way of the American nation and give them 200 years to change before the American nation got this far west. With the technology of 1803, it might have taken that long. But of course, things changed. In the meantime, they're moving the 5 civilized tribes out of the American Southeast to an environment that they're familiar with. including this area that would have been an outlet for the Cherokees who settled in country they were familiar with, which would be the Boston Mountains, the Arkansas River Valley up to Muskogee. This would be their outlet to the hunting lands of the high plains. So the Cherokee outlet name comes from that. This would be an outlet for the Cherokees to pass back and forth. Well, that remained that way until 1861. The Civil War would change it all. The Cherokees would side with the Confederates, fight against the Union Army. We would have more than 80 Civil War battles in what is now the state of Oklahoma, including the biggest of them all, the Battle of Honey Springs on July 17, 1863, at a little creek community about 4 miles north of Chakotah. You know where Chakotah is. We're going to have a reenactment of that here. We just celebrated the 150th anniversary of that battle. Well, the conclusion of all of this is that, of course, the Confederacy loses, the tribes are punished by the federal government, and the federal government takes away their western lands. With the idea that as we're defeating other tribes in the Great Lakes area, and the High Plains, and in the American Southwest, we have a place to move these other tribes. And they start that today, 39 federally recognized tribes, because of that policy and that punishment. And so here come the Cheyenne and Arapaho, the Kiowa and Comanche. Here come the Quapaw and the Peoria and all the other tribes, the Tonkawa, moving back to this state. Today, because of that, we have more Indian people than any other state in the Union. And that's not per capita, that's absolute numbers of Indian people. Oklahoma has more Indian people than California. But it's also affecting what's happening here because those Reconstruction treaties of 1866 that punish the 5 tribes have a provision, 2 provisions I'll mention. One is that railroads can now cross the Indian Territory. The 5 tribes had been politically astute enough to keep the railroads out of the Indian Territory because they knew with the railroads would come white people and merchants and those who would demand openings to general settlement. The other provision is that the Indian tribes had to start working towards statehood in general allotment of the land to individuals rather than communal ownership of the lands. Both of those started in 1866. That's a pivot point in our entire history. Well, as a result, in 1886, the Santa Fe, what would become the Santa Fe, builds a couple of lines into the Indian Territory. One comes through eastern Oklahoma and connects with the first railroad, 1871, the old Katy tracks going north and south, largely what is now Highway 69, connecting settled Missouri with settled Texas. Then they build east and west, north and south through the middle of the territory, the line that goes through Guthrie and Oklahoma City, Perry. That was built 1886, 87, plus this line cutting through the northwest part of the state. The same Santa Fe line that comes through Alva today. So as times are changing, the politics begins to change. The railroads, who are the oil companies and the health insurance industry, all lumped into one politically at the time, they convinced Congress, you've got to open this land to non-Indian settlers. And so in 1889, they have the first of the transfers of public land to non-Indian ownership. That's the unassigned lands in central Oklahoma. April 22nd, 1889, 50,000 people. The towns of Oklahoma City, Norman, Guthrie, Stillwater, Kingfisher, all settled on that one day. Then subsequent land openings to the east, to the west, and the Cheyenne and Arapaho lands. And then the biggest land run of all, both in terms of area and numbers involved, opening of the Cherokee Strip. September 16th, 1893, I think that's right. Is that right, Donovan? I think it is. Is that right, Museum Director? And so we have this run in Alva with location on the railroad, location, and a key part of the outlet becomes the land office location. And so the site is surveyed before the land run. People know that is going to be a major community on the railroad, so they come. And others come to the rich farmland around Alva and in Woods County. Western parts of this territory, a lot of that land would not be homesteaded until 1901, 2, and 3. My wife's family from Woodward County, who settled around Tangier and Sharon, they were still homesteading their lands in 1903. But here, richer farmland, they came. Territorial government has already been organized, meeting in Guthrie. After 1890, they make a decision. Where are the institutions going to be in this new territory and soon to be state? The first 3 higher education institutions, of course, had been in the first area organized as Oklahoma Territory, which would have been the unassigned lands. So guess where the first 3 institutions went? Stillwater, Norman, and Edmond. Well, as you have subsequent land openings and more people and more immigration in, they need more institutions of higher education. And one of those in 1897 is established in Alva, Oklahoma, with the railroad communication, with the rich farmland. Because the Indian Territory is still not part of the government. What is now southwestern Oklahoma is still not part of the government. And so with representation at a higher proportion, the college comes here in 1897. And a year later, the boom begins. Your history in this county, this community, was shaped largely by what would happen between 1898 and 1918. And that was one of the golden age of American farming. If you'll get an economic history of the U.S. and look up golden age of farming, it's 1898 to 1918. Well, that's because the prices largely were going up for farm commodities on the world stage. Farmers were doing better at that time than they had ever done before, and better than they've ever done since. For years we heard about parity. We want parity with what we can grow as a farmer and what we have to spend on our quality of life. Well, they use this time period to measure that. It had never been better, never be as good again. Well, in that time period, it happens for several reasons. One, you have those prices going up that are helping all farmers. But we have added value here because fresh land. Boll weevil's not here yet. We're getting new strains of winter wheat that are coming in with the Mennonites and the Germans from Russia. The new research station at A&M. And so farming is improving. Mechanization is brand new at this time, so one farmer can produce more than just what he could do with a mule and a big family. And on top of that, the rains come back in 96 and 97, so we have a good period of moisture. The land is fresh. The 1 decade of the most railroad construction in our history, from 1900 to 1910, there are more miles of track laid in this state than all the decades combined before or since. So you take that 1 10-year period, take all the miles of railroad track laid, it exceeds every other decade combined. It was a perfect time with people coming here for one last chance to make a living as a farmer and a rancher. And they came and the economy boomed. On top of that was the boom of oil. Oil was first discovered in commercial quantities in Bartlesville, near Bartlesville, in 1898. They knew oil was in the area after Spindletop in Texas in 1901. That depletes almost overnight. They discover oil near Tulsa, a little field called Red Rock. It's not a great field, but enough to attract people. Then in 1905, after the Creek Indians had received title to their land and they could actually sell their leases to somebody, then suddenly these oil people are in the territory, the Indian individuals have the right to lease their minerals, and suddenly you get one lease sold on a lease owned by Ida Glenn. With money raised out of Oklahoma City, Charles Colcord invests in that well, and the Glen Pool opens with a 50,000 barrel a day well. In 1905, it's the first giant field. Here comes the oil patch from West Virginia and Pennsylvania and southern New York and southern Ohio, from Texas, and here they come to the Indian Territory. Thereafter, as they stretch out around the territory, they find the fields of Cushing and the Greater Osage, the Carter County field, and up here, the Three Sands with E.W. Martin using this new technology developed at OU called seismography. And so they're using the scientific approach, this new technology called rotary drilling in the 1920s to go deeper, to find the resources that are here. And suddenly you have the oil boom starting. So oil on top of farm and ranch. We're the fastest growing state from 1907 to 1930. And our population is on this kind of a course affecting Alva and Woods County in general. If few other things happening in that decade, the age of highways. So the pivot point going from railroads to highways as a primary mode of transportation starts in the 20s. I'm going to fail here by about 3 minutes. But this all starts in 1923. What we now call the Oklahoma Department of Transportation can date its history back to 1923. The first tax on motor fuel was enacted by the legislature that year to provide matching funds to give these new funds available through the Federal Highway Act of 1921 that made federal funds available in block grants to the states. But we had to have professional engineers, statewide control. That starts in 23. By 25, led by Cyrus Avery, a county commissioner out of Tulsa County, becomes chief of the first interstate highway system in 1925, and he makes sure that this transcontinental road comes through Oklahoma. We call it Route 66. They started in 1925, would pave the last part of track in 1936. And it's changing life in this part of the state as well. That transition from rail to road is beginning. Then the hard times. Farmers start suffering in the 20s. Prices are going down. The boll weevil finds its way to the west, and cotton is even being farmed in this territory at the time. And farmers begin to suffer. Mechanization. One farmer suddenly needs more than 80 acres to make a middle-class living with his family. Suddenly they need a full quarter. Then they need more. Well, today, that has continued since. If you don't have 2,000 acres, you're a hobby farmer. You just can't make it with less. Mechanization is beginning to change. The drought, the Dust Bowl, even though you're not in the Dust Bowl, you're on the edge of it. Storms coming through. Drought affected all of Oklahoma. The prices continued down, especially after the stock market crash in 1929. Onset of the Great Depression that would reach its lowest points by 1933 when oil was 10 cents a barrel. You could not have your cotton picked because the cost of having it picked was greater than what you would get at the gin. These are hard times, people leaving the land. I bet each one of us Oklahoma families has a story of someone going to California. My oldest uncle from Chickasha left and went. This out-migration from 1930 to 1960, our population would go down. And it's largely happening in rural Oklahoma and in small towns. While the cities of Oklahoma City and Tulsa maintain population, even grows somewhat, small towns begin losing population, people moving off of the farms. The dynamics of running lumber yards and newspapers and car dealerships is beginning to change. Your customer base is changing. In Alva, you still have the university. And it strengthened, in fact, in 1940 and 41 with the adoption of the Regions for Higher Education that somewhat takes higher education out of politics. Alfalfa Bill Murray, elected governor in 1930, took on in 1930, replaced every president just because he wanted to. Well, that could not happen again, so more stability, more continuity in higher education that would affect you here. And then World War II. World War II did bring us out of the Great Depression. It changed the landscape of the country. It is a pivot point for the entire nation and for the world in the 20th century. Well, here, there was another story added with a POW camp. In 1942, the U.S. Army decided they need to somehow take the prisoners that were being captured in North Africa and later in Europe and move them somewhere in the United States. They wanted them away from urban areas. They wanted them in a, they called it mild climate. If you call Oklahoma mild, I guess in days before air conditioning we consider that mild. And in rural areas where there's a lot of farming because we needed farm labor. Well, in Oklahoma, what do we have, 6 or 7 base camps? McAllister, Camp Gruber, Tonkawa, Alva, Fort Reno. And so we have those base camps established in field camps. But those people are here to go out and work the farms and to contribute to the American war effort. Then you have that history here that needs to be linked to all of this. And of all the camps in Oklahoma, I think you had the biggest one here in Alva. And it was the Nazi lager. The hardest core Nazis were sent here, so it has national and international significance. Coming out of World War II, turning points would be things like the Interstate Highways, initiated during the Eisenhower administration in '57, would not be completed, though, until the early '90s. It took forever to finish the interstate highway system. You get the further growth of cities, hard times for smaller towns. You have a depressed oil and gas industry because, as one of my friends in the oil industry said, it's never been how much oil and gas is left, but it's how much oil and gas is left at what price. Well, in the 1950s and 60s into the 1970s, the oil and gas that people knew was still buried in Oklahoma could not be extracted based on the price because of imported oil from the Middle East, where America, the Netherlands, Great Britain had messed around with the politics coming out of World War I and into World War II. And here we have this flow of cheap oil, almost destroying the domestic exploration and production. Oklahoma companies like Kerr-McGee could not make it as contract drillers in Oklahoma anymore. That's why they went offshore. It's the only place they could make it. Why take the risk of offshore drilling unless you have to? Well, they had to, or go out of business. Why go to the North Sea unless you have to? They had to. Why go into countries like the Congo, in Colombia, Libya? Well, you do it because you have to. Our domestic oil industry was depressed. It was affecting you here in Woods County and Alva. We know about the deep gas boom. You were on the edge of that. It was based on artificial prices, based on a change in regulation. In 1956, the federal government decides to regulate the flow of natural gas from state to state for the first time ever, when it was largely a waste product anyway, so no one objected strenuously at the time. But it's regulated. You get to the 1960s and the growing use of natural gas around the country. Suddenly those politicians from Illinois and New York want to keep the price low for their constituents. So through politics they keep it artificially low until you can't produce natural gas for the price you can get across state lines. Oklahoma Natural Gas is drilling here because it's intrastate. They can still get market value. You get partial deregulation in the 70s with Robert Hefner III, but only on deep gas, which is in the deep Anadarko, right on the edge of where we are today. We have a boom. With hyperinflation coming off the gold exchange standard, 1971, people are looking for a place to put their money because inflation is nearing 20%. Some of you may remember taking out loans for 20% in the late 70s. Well, they could put that money into deep gas and quadruple their money in a year with some of these big wells. So here comes the money from Chicago and Seattle and the Netherlands and London. And it is flowing so rapidly, a little reckless. Then suddenly, Ronald Reagan becomes president and overnight deregulates natural gas. Suddenly, the old shallow gas is the same price as deep gas. And so, overnight, deep gas crumbles. Banks fail. I'm sure there were banks in Alva. Did a bank survive here? They all survived. Well, that's better than most communities in this part of the state. But a banking crisis starts. That would continue until people like Tom Ward and Aubrey McClendon in 1989 started a new business that they called Chesapeake, based on land and finding the land, and the price of oil is still fluctuating. Even after Tom and Aubrey started, the price of oil got down to $40 a barrel at one point, almost bankrupted them, but they hung on. And with the new technology that we now call horizontal drilling, fracking, suddenly opens up deeper deposits, natural gas boom, then oil. We're seeing the results of that today. But the families who came in 1893 and put down their roots and survived the hard times, those who came into the university after that point to teach, those who came in here after the war looking for opportunity, added to this mix that you have in Woods County and in Alva, in dealing with the legacy of all of these connecting points, are still trying to improve your quality of life, to drive the economy, to make sure that your kids and grandkids have a little bit of hope that this community can support them with the life that they want. But only if we understand each of these turning points can we make the right decisions as community leaders. And the museums and the historic preservation ties into that. Because the only way we will know about the impact of all of this is to collect, preserve, and share. We've got to save that POW camp. We've got to share it with the rest of the world and tell the story of sacrifice during World War II and all other wars. We've got to make sure that museum survives and prospers so we can gather these stories of pioneers. We've got to include the story of oil and gas, of farmers and ranchers, of the merchants downtown. We've got to make sure your Main Street program is vigorous in helping to save those buildings so we get a sense of this connection between the present and the past. Well, I'm here today. David Pettyjohn from POK is here today. We will be here to help with all of this. We've already come up with a 5-step plan to get started with how all of these dots can be connected. If we can do that, then your children and grandchildren hopefully can connect the dots to the point that they say, yes, I want to live in Alva. Yes, this is where my future is. I look forward to seeing Alva grow and prosper in the coming years. Thank you very much.
Thank you.